essence, in the last 5 years, we have consumed as much material as we have done since 1900 until 2020. And what will naturally happen if you go to peak production and also peak addiction is that sooner or later that production will decline.
We are energy blind. But we've also forgotten what raw materials and minerals do for us. We are materials blind. We've forgotten how all this happens.
When it comes to China, what's interesting is that you don't find any single policy, like this kind of critical raw materials act as a, kind of grand strategy design.
The inputs for solar and wind energy are abundant. To serve us, they need material infrastructure. China and Europe pursue different strategies in line with the capacities of their economic and political systems. The planet lacks the materials for all nation-states to come out on top. Welcome to our times of post-peak materials.
Good day, everybody, to this series of the Cosmolab on the emerging area of energy and materials. In today's episode, we have three distinguished gentlemen. We have Simon Michaux, Associate Professor Geometallurgy and Mineral Processing. We have Hermann Aubié, a Senior Researcher of Chinese Studies at the University of Turku. And we have Marcel Vester, the Project Manager of Resource Wende. Now, when it comes to this arena of energy and materials, maybe it is a good idea to start by describing the context. Where do we find ourselves now? And may I invite you, Marcel, to maybe kick off with a description from you.
If I have a presentation in a room, sometimes I ask the question, whom of you in this room can predict the future? And well, hardly anybody dares to put up his hand. And that means that we have to think about multiple futures. And it looks like we are currently gearing up to one paradigm of the future, which is, if I may make it very simplistic, which is about geopolitical power play on one side. That has happened in the area of raw materials and energy. And the other thing is that we, at least in the West, have always thought that we can pursue continuous economic growth. Let me put that as one future, really very simplistic. Now, in the resource Wende, we said, could there be another future? And we have done a lot of investigation around energy and resources. And I would like to take you on a very short journey where we ended up, if that's okay. Our first conclusion was that since, well, beginning of times, we can see that material consumption has exponentially grown. And that's important to realize. Not many people understand exponential growth, but in essence, in the last 5 years, we have consumed as much material as we have done since 1900 until 2020. That is what all exponential growth is all about. That's very good to realize. And what we are seeing is that we try to squeeze our consumption of materials and our mining in a shorter time as possible, not leaving much behind for future generations, and even not leaving much behind for the poorer countries. So we are gearing up to what we call a kind of peak production of raw materials. And what will naturally happen if you go to a peak production and also peak addiction is that sooner or later that production will decline. And the key question is, from the resource Wende perspective, are we prepared for that decline? And our opinion is that we are not prepared for that decline, and that potentially we will get into chaos within our economies and our societies. So, to summarize, the key question for us is, how do we ensure that there are multiple futures? So not only a future of geopolitical power play and economic growth and grabbing what you need, that's one future, but there could be another future where we need to prepare ourselves for maybe more sharing around the world, and also thinking about what do we leave behind for future generations.
Am I correct in understanding that you're saying that that peak scenario for oil will also replicate for other materials than oil?
We will have peak productions for many, many materials. And as you can imagine, we are dependent. These materials are dependent upon each other in their application. So yes, indeed, we will have peak production for not only oil, but for many, many other raw materials in this age. And we need to prepare for that.
For the last couple of years, I've been now operating to actually sort of develop, examine questions like, what does fossil fuels actually do for us? The same question could be asked, what does the Chinese industrial value chain do for us? So when we say things like we are going to replace fossil fuels, okay, good idea, as in we have to, because peak oil is now, I believe, an observation. In November 2018, crude oil peaked, and since then we've actually sort of been on a plateau with periods of decline. So it's not a theory anymore, it's an observation. And you may have noticed since 2018, it's been one damn thing after another, and all sorts of things are going wrong in context of a complex system is under strain, and it will produce a series of complex outcomes. So what I came to the conclusion, when I actually sort of mapped out, if we were to apply the green transition, no more chit chat, we will now apply the green transition as the European Commission and the International Energy Agency describe. Wind and solar become the primary energy systems going forward. All transport is now electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells. Okay, great. What would that look like if we were to replace the existing system whole cloth and maintain existing capability based on the numbers of 2018? And what I found, and so I worked out how many units we're talking about, how big is the system? And the first insight was the task to phase out fossil fuels is orders of magnitude larger than we think, or what existing policy allows us to think.
A buffer of 6 hours of no wind and no solar power is our current assumption.
That's the current assumption. And what I found was wind and solar underperform for months at a time. But if that had to be kept stable, we would need 23 days of buffer capacity. But here's the interesting part: when it actually went from summer into winter, solar power underperformed, and it did not recover until the following summer, which means that 23 days would have to be kept in storage for 212 days. And when I did the same study in Hawaii, of all places, where the sun shines pretty well, they needed 29 days based on the data that we had. Okay, so what this is saying is what wind and solar actually are have not been fully understood if we were to scale them up and make them the primary energy systems. Okay, and so there's a number of discussions about where do we get that power storage from? Like, will pumped hydro work? Will hydrogen work? And so on and so forth. All of those we can discuss that, but the short answer is they all have their scaling problems, and battery banks are the system that would work and don't have the scaling problems, but then you've got the resource problems. The path that we are on at the moment is not viable. It has resource shortfalls that if we do get around them, we've got to do some very serious problem solving. But at the moment, we're not doing that because we're not even recognizing what that is. What I believe will happen is the green transition, lithium-ion battery chemistries, and the plan for the green transition will hit a point where it's shown not to be viable. And I think the commercial groups around the world have already made that decision. And they will withdraw from the idea of mass manufacturing of batteries and wind turbines and what have you. Fossil fuels are still going. So we do need the after fossil fuel plan now. So the futures, so then Marcel's work kicks in. And so, well, we've got a series of futures. We could go this path, or that path. And what I believe will happen is we will be forced into a situation where our existing system will deteriorate and we are required to move off it. The planned future of the green transition will not work and be shown to be impractical very quickly. And then there'll be a flurry of activity and the classic panic of run about, wave your arms and scream and shout with regard to what do we do. And there'll be a series of futures which are fundamentally reorder and reorganizing what we might do.
You said that everything that's available in raw materials and also recycled materials, resources, reserves, and even seabed mining is only a fraction of what we need. Can you help our audience understand when you say fraction? How big or little is that?
When we get to solid state batteries, one of the metals required is germanium. And we need something like to take out 1/3 of the battery market, which is what has been predicted by 2050. We need something like 4 million tons of germanium. But we are producing 130 tons a year at the moment. So we're talking 30,000 years of production if we were to hit that target. Not even close. This doesn't reflect the mineralogy involved. Now, we can make batteries out of something else, like sodium or zinc okay, but every battery chemistry I've looked at, in fact, if we're going to electrify things, we will need copper. We will probably need nickel. We will need graphite. And most of the time, we need cobalt. Right, so what I'm saying here is at a very fundamental level, the target to reach for the lithium-ion chemistry is not just like an efficiency gain here and there, or we just need to work a little bit longer. The differences are so massive that I don't think we're going to do it, especially if we think we're going to do it in 25 years between now and 2050. Right? Not a chance. Because remember, it takes to discover a new deposit anywhere between 5 years and 20 years to discover the deposit into a resource. And what that means is getting drilling permits and doing, resource estimate. To take the estimated resource to a report of mineral reserve, that's called a feasibility study, a pre-feas. That is 7 or 8 years. Again, more drilling, more permitting, more studying. To take a reported mineral reserve to a producing mine is between 15 and 20 years. Right. Now, for every 10 producing mines, 3 or 4 of them will go out of business because of market conditions. So what I'm saying is resources have a fundamentally different cycle, but our world, especially here in Europe, is technology, and technology has an incubation time of about 18 months. As in a new idea comes along, let's develop it and we're away. Resources are fundamentally different. That's 20, even 30 years cycles to get things going. And one of the problems, one of the bottlenecks, the blind spots, if you will, is we have forgotten what energy does for us. We are energy blind. But we've also forgotten what raw materials and minerals do for us. We are materials blind. We've forgotten how all this happens, and it just happens in the background and magic happens. Energy is the master resource. And so when that peaks and declines, like peak oil, November 2018, and we are a petroleum-driven society, the data shows that to be quite clear, we've got to move off that energy system to a new energy system. What is that?
I want to pivot at this moment to Hermann, to hear from Hermann. How do the Chinese look at this? Are they underscoring the same paradigm as we are in Europe, or are they fundamentally in a different paradigm? And what is their view on the raw materials and how to use them? And then once we have that perspective included, we can have a look at what alternative futures might look like. But I'm really curious to hear now, but we've looked at the European perspective, what the Asian perspective looks like. So Hermann, could you expand on that a little bit?
China's story really in this global story is a bit tricky to capture, in a clear-cut fashion between the local and the global, if you like, because I think a lot of what the Chinese decided to do over the last couple of decades when it comes to critical raw materials and energy security has been pretty much playing out as a domestic story first. The focus of the Chinese Communist Party was really energy security through diversification of supply, and then the emerging realization that in order to industrialize and to secure resources, they needed basically to have their own distinct strategy facing, the incumbent giants from OECD industries. And for that, they really, focused on this diversified, procurement strategy. And then, of course, they were aware that they could build up capacity for refining. So once they could secure the raw materials, they were quite confident that they could upscale the refining technology and capacity, and then they needed, of course, as well to address a whole range of issues related to industrialization in the early mid stages. For example, air quality has been a huge public health concerns in the largest cities. And so to shift from fossil fuels to renewables was seen as a practical way not only of solving these domestic issues, but also of leapfrogging the incumbents, so to speak, in OECD industries. So I think it's fair to say that there's been, you could say, this typical complacency of the incumbents. We've seen that playing out in Germany, for example. We've heard the story about solar and battery and this feeling of deja vu now with electric cars and wind turbines, and it's something that I think comes from this perception gap, this lack of policy dialogue and alignment, the distrust that there is between China and OECD countries. And there was this strategic foresight in China that was already, I think, being developed, at a time when basically the OECD democracies were kind of feeling relatively confident about, using the global market forces as the main mechanism, basically to procure what they need. And then the wake-up call, of course, was, I think, the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. This acted as watershed moments to make, the Critical Raw Material Act a reality. But then, of course, when it comes to China, what's interesting is that you don't find any single policy, like this kind of Critical Raw Materials Act as a, kind of grand strategy design. It's more like a result of incremental strategic decisions that have been made in the field of industry and energy security, and then resource security paradigm being, of course, critical here. And the fact that China operates, with a different kind of a time frame as well than, electoral democracies. They can adopt, for example, the Made in China 2025 strategy in 2016. So that gives them a 10-year frame. And this is also often pinpointed by commentators on China affairs related to energy and critical raw materials as one comparative advantage with democracies. And the Koreans and the Japanese, interestingly, they have a different approach in that respect. They kept the hand of the state, quite visible in this critical sector, and you can see that in a way Europe is catching up now, pretty much mimicking what the Koreans and Japanese have been doing before them.
Have you seen anything that looks at how big the task is? Like how many solar panels, how many electric vehicles do they think they're going to make?
You mean like some kind of forecasting scenarios about their capacity to upscale?
Physical units on the ground, what target do we have to hit?
That's
The answer is no. I've not been able to find anything.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of secrecy around the nationwide kind of targets. I've been searching for those numbers, and for example, the strategic stockpiles, they are not as transparent as the Korean and Japanese ones. So it's a bit tricky to have this kind of forecasting capacity with the Chinese.
And if you look at all those different continents that pursue their own dominance and have their America first, Europe first, China first, Russia first, if you pile up all those demands, then our conviction is that that's not enough for everybody. Even leaving behind the other countries who don't have that strategy. And I have to be honest about China. I admire what they have been doing, although it's not a grand strategy as you call it. It's domestically built up, but they have such a dominant position, and they do it so clever that we can't escape from mimicking what they are doing. But still, if you pile all those mimics up, it doesn't end up with what's available. And that's the discussion, that's the debate we would like to have. Okay, I can imagine that initially you would like to be a geopolitical force, otherwise you don't have a position on the table. But if you are on the table, then you need to start the discussion. I think, guys, what we all want together can't happen, even apart from the fact of scarcity, but also looking from a climate, from a biodiversity, from a social, ecological perspective, it won't happen. And then the fair question is, okay, if it doesn't happen, do we close our eyes and continue until the chaos hits us? Or do we want to have another deliberate strategy where we think about not violence and chaos, but organized and a civilized fashion of having another global and national route of approaching this energy and resource crisis situation?
Instead of the crash landing, what soft landing options do you have in mind with Resource Wende?
Ideally, I think we should talk about what is our global budget of resources. Like we do, what's our global budget of CO2? And then you can talk about, well, if this is the global budget, what is a fair distribution of this budget among countries? And that would be the idealistic approach. And I'm sure that that's not going to happen. Like in climate, it's a huge debate. How do we divide the money? How do we divide the CO2 budget? But that would be the ideal route, in my opinion. And if you have budgets, then you can go to a country level and a business sector level, and you say, okay, this is what you have available. Now start the negotiations to at least have basic human services for every human on the earth. That would be the ideal scenario, if there is any ideal scenario. And I hope we will land somewhere in the middle where we prevent a war for resources and chaos.
I was based in the Geological Survey of Finland in the circular economy division. I had a mandate to look at the circular economy. I was from the mining industry. I knew about resources. I'm also a physicist, which means I understand energy systems. Okay. So I did a tour of duty through all energy systems for a report in 2021 that I looked at, and I found every single conventional system had its shortcomings in some form or another. None of them are going to work. As in, they work on a small scale, but they cannot be scaled up, and that's the issue. The commodities sector has been misunderstood. Resources have been misunderstood. We do things at the moment where we manage our resources with no thought for the future at all. The market takes care of all and resources are infinite. That is the belief, right? So this has to change. So what I take what we call the circular economy and evolve it into the resource balanced economy. And what I'm doing here is proper resource stewardship where we get the most out of every resource, and mining and recycling emerge together, right? and waste management is connected directly to manufacture, but manufacture becomes simpler. Society has to become simpler, and it's an industrial network has to shrink in size. We have to go from a just-in-time supply grid across 6 continents to doing everything we need in a single city or a region around the city. So we have to run society on a smaller number of components where so instead of having, say, um, uh, hundreds of different kinds of electric motors, we run our city on 1 or 2 electric motors replicated many times. And instead of, we have to develop the capacity for the full value chain from raw materials all the way up to manufacture of complete goods locally. So this is actually what's required of this is what happens when the energy of a system contracts. The complexity and size of a biological entity, some kind of biological thing, is defined by the energy available to run it. If that energy reduces, then the size of the organism and the complexity of the organism will shrink. And as we move off fossil fuels, whatever happens next is going to be less energy content and less effective. So we are looking at a contraction. Growth-based economics will now move into contraction-based economics, ergo as a virtue of fossil fuels being phased out. Okay, so we have to become simpler and more self-reliant.
I want to explore with the three of us, what could that mean for what an economy needs to look at, right? Are we finally going to include the externalities, yes or no? What monetary system could drive that? What does it mean if we decouple and go to different biomes using different systems, right? And what would the governance, what could that look like if the ideal scenario of Marcel doesn't work out at supranational level and we have to go down to a regional system-based governance? Could I invite all of you to reflect on that as a sort of a concept before we move on to maybe the details of the purple transition?
I think the idea here is that we need to have this kind of hope-based, mid-long-term vision, like Marcel mentioned. Like the concept, I think, of a global resource budget is interesting under the UN. But of course, to get there, in order not to remain wishful thinking, we would need some concrete measures to first overcome the distrust, I think, that feeds this zero-sum game mentality, right? I mean, in China, they talk a lot in policy documents and official discourse about self-sufficiency. In Europe, we talk about strategic autonomy. In the US, it's America first. I think the Koreans and the Japanese, they also have a lot of distrust in store. They are fierce competitors in the market. So we have all these export control measures making headlines, which create this kind of a trust eroding escalation, right? It's this idea that let's capture as many resources as we can while we can and stockpile as much as we can, and so this is just a reflection, I think, of the level of distrust there is nowadays, and this sovereignty first concerns, they are not sustainable, right? I mean, we know that interdependence is not going away. It's just that we need a strategic interdependence, which is more differentiated, in the way we operationalize our procurement and refining of resources. And so now we see in Europe the way this plays out, right? Like Austria just approved the opening of a lithium mine without an environmental impact assessment. And the Serbian people are protesting because they say you are hypocritical. You want to drive, electric SUVs that we cannot afford and mine it in our backyard. So we need to, do a lot to, I think, build that trust. And for that, I think politicians need to start walking the talk.
In China to start this up, or is it still BRICS against the OECD, or how does it
Yeah, I haven't seen much future thinking being done collectively between China and the BRICS, for example. I believe also the futures based approaches are quite undeveloped in, for example, in Chinese academia. I mean, in Finland, we have a lot of future studies, and there have been attempts to establish partnerships with Chinese colleagues, and they didn't find a lot happening there. So I think they are still in the early stages, of developing this future-proof thinking, so to speak. Yeah, that's kind of ironic because they the strategic oversight of the CCP when it comes to energy security is actually quite good at anticipating risks through diversification. But then in the public or scholarly debate, it seems that there's not so much going on there. So it's more like pragmatic approach, I think, and strategic approach that explains China's behavior.
Simon, maybe back to you on what your thoughts are around the economic, monetary, and governance consequences of that set of specifications that you just kicked off with.
The way it is, how funding happens to all industrial systems, but also research as well. And until we change that, nothing changes. Money is the heart of everything that we do, and it's intrinsically, I believe it's intrinsically flawed. What we call neoclassical economics has theoretical issues that need to be resolved. The first problem is it can't tell the difference between a man-made capital outcome and a natural capital outcome. So it thinks all natural resources are indistinguishable. It also does not allow for all the external costs, the true costs of an action to happen, where, say, industrial pollution is ignored or considered someone else's problem, or is seen as an economic opportunity for someone to make money on to clean up. Right, so everything's seen in isolation. The very theory of our economics has to go towards what's called ecological economics. And a requirement, or not a requirement, if we are to truly act on what we now call civilized consciousness, is we have to start valuing life as part of our economics. How do we do that? I don't know, but that's a target. I also think the nature of money at the moment, in 1972, the US dollar decoupled from the gold standard because it was faced with a bankruptcy. Like there was a long-running problem of how things had been run. And then in 1973, the petrodollar agreement, where all oil sold by Saudi Arabia was to be sold in US dollars. And that forced the entire world to interact with a fiat currency, where if they wanted to balance the budget, they just printed more money. All currencies, well, until recently, were fiat from that point on. So what that meant was, if they wanted to spend money on something or some sort of venture, they could just print money to balance the budget. So we decoupled ourselves from reality, right? So we decoupled ourselves from reality and have moved forward in an idea where ideology is more important. If we believe something, it is true. If we believe something is not true, then we don't have to face that reality. And this is at the heart of our monetary system. What I believe is coming is a currency reset where we move out of one currency car into another. But that new currency has to be somehow tied to the material world. I can see a situation where a new currency is developed that is intrinsically linked to what resources we have left, which will then lead to the idea of resource stewardship. It will be part of our thinking to be very careful what we do with our resources. For example, if we had a money shortage, and money requires us is what's required to do anything. If there's a money shortage, we become very, very, very careful what we do with our money, and we think all things through, attached to all decisions associated with our money. That thinking has to be shifted to resources, and if we can do it, some sort of ecological footprint as well. So these are fundamental thinkings that are a little abstract for the average person, and most civil servants will just look at this, nah, you're crazy, that's not going to happen. But our existing systems are breaking apart at the moment, and we have to actually understand how they're breaking apart and why, and what will be required to patch them together, as in whatever replaces them has got to be resilient, otherwise they're going to break apart too. And that's the kind of evolution I can see sort of happening in terms of money. I do see regional areas like Europe struggling to survive because the European Central Bank is printing money on a monthly basis now, just like everyone else. There's a vast amount of debt in the system. That debt has been applied between nation states, but the nation states themselves don't hold the debt. It's the private banks. Each central bank is actually a private entity. They're not actually run by the government. So the government of each nation state has incurred a lot of debt, but the private sector holds the debt, which means a government can't just have a debt jubilee and have all debt cancel each other out, because the private sector won't allow that. So I can see a change in terms of where does money come from, who controls it, who regulates it. And at the moment, the private sector, since the formation of the Federal Reserve in the United States in 1913, and the fractional reserve banking system that actually sort of was brought online where they can just invent more money out of thin air, all of that's going to have to be scrapped and replaced with something else. And whatever that is, it has to be matched with reality. And in a very challenging environment where lots of stuff's going wrong and coming apart at the seams, that monetary system has to be strong enough and resilient enough to deal with that kind of chaos as we can trust it. So I can see the financial sector going through serious upheaval, much more serious than most people think. It's not just a currency reset where we just put in a new euro and just shoot all the politicians and bring in some new people. And we have a good old-fashioned war, for example, to cover the fact that we've just been through a reset and bring in economic value that way. None of that works.
And just curious, Herman, I read a few stories about the debt problems in China as well. Does China already have some thoughts around how they should deal with this?
Yeah, the debt issue is quite complex and prominent this last couple of years in China. And a lot of the recent measures that Beijing has adopted to stimulate or stabilize rather the economy is about mitigating the risks associated with the growing debt, especially of local government. And in fact, if we look at China's let's say green transition, and the industry driving it, what they called in Chinese the three new, basically batteries, renewable, and the electric cars. They hope to replace the pillar that real estate and infrastructure used to be for Chinese economy with these three new, at least partly. But there are already lots of economists who say it's impossible. Even if China was to capture a massive share of the global market, they would not be able to replace real estate and infrastructure. And so, yeah, you can also, you've heard about overcapacity or overproduction. It can be debated, but there is this problem that China has built this capacity to produce, for example, steel at scale, or aluminium or copper, not just for green tech, but of course for the infrastructure as well. And now this is kind of receding. So you can see the steel furnaces in China having real problems. I mean, they are facing, serious debt issues already because of overcapacity. And many of them are powered by coal, cheap coal coming from Mongolia, for example. And so there is this big question mark whether they will manage to navigate the green transition in a stable fashion. And the debt issue is going to remain because they cannot anymore stimulate by providing more credit lines. The local governments have wasted too much of that debt money over the last 10, 15 years. And now in Beijing, they face this dilemma that they need to, in the name of domestic stability and national security, they need to inject this money to stabilize the economy because there's no welfare, social safety net basically to buttress the shock. They need to keep people employed in one way or another, and so yeah, they are accumulating debt anyway, so it's not sustainable. And I think it fits well into what Simon just said about the limitations of the current monetary system. I mean, we need to reimagine it for sure, but I don't see a lot of discussion about that in China.
I think if I take a step back and reflect on what I've heard, I think the context that has been set, right, is that we are in an era of peak materials, with the observation of peak oil in 2018, and the work of Simon Michaux saying that in terms of new resources needed to keep up this exponential use of materials, we're going to need a tenfold or sometimes even 100-fold of current production levels to just keep it up, and those resources aren't there. We are in the age of peak materials. And this has a lot of consequences for all of us here on the planet. We can't have Chinese self-sufficiency, MAGA in the US, and always a open strategic autonomy in Europe and just hope that we'll end up in the right space.
Let's assume that we have global budgets, and let's assume that we allocate those budgets in different ways, either honestly between countries or other ways. And what does that mean for European countries? If they have a limited budget, what do you do with your energy security? What do you do with basic human services? And that's exactly the exercise we want to do, having different scenarios and then looking how that would look like for European countries or regions within European countries.
Gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time. I wish all of us the best for the future and have a very, very good day to you. Thank you very much.